So I'd like to start by just doing a very short reading from Chapter 1, China's Feminist Five. When Chinese authorities arrested feminist activist Wei Tingting in Beijing on March 6, 2015, just before International Women's Day, they confiscated her glasses so she could no longer see. Severely visually impaired, Wei was only able to tell people apart by their voices. State security agents took away her cell phone and laptop and demanded her passwords. They led her to a dimly lit underground area of a police station, took her warm snow boots and put her in a small, unheated room about 5 square meters wide as the temperature outside fell to below freezing. Then the interrogations began. Why are you engaged in subversive activities about sexual harassment? Who is collaborating with you in your women's rights activism? Which foreign agencies are funding your actions? Wei told the blurry figures in front of her that she wanted to call a lawyer before answering any questions. You can't call a lawyer now, don't you get it? Don't you understand the law? Wei made it through one round of interrogations and thought it would be over. But in the middle of the night, she had no idea what time it was because she had no watch. The agents took her out for another interrogation. This time, someone videotaped her as she spoke. Even when she went to the toilet, a female agent observed her. For the first time in her life, Wei Tingting, just 26 years old at the time of her detention, began to think about escaping abroad. She felt disoriented and overwhelmed by a mounting sense of powerlessness. Then she heard some indistinct murmurs seeping through from outside and put her ear up against the wall of her cell to listen more closely. With astonishment, she recognized the voice of one of her feminist sisters, Wang Man, who had taken part in some activist campaigns with her in the adjacent room. My God, Wang Man is in here too, she thought. Wei yelled out to a guard that she was thirsty and needed a drink of water, then put her ear up against the wall to listen again. She made out the voices of other feminist activists who had been arrested along with her. Besides Wang Man, she could hear Li Maizi, Li's girlfriend, Teresa Xu, and several other university students who had volunteered for feminist campaigns in the past. Wei later described how she overcame her feeling of helplessness in an online essay she called Prison Notes, which she posted on WeChat under a pseudonym. I decided I must resist this feeling of sorrow and take action, so I started to do a lot of different things. My room was freezing and I was only allowed to wear slippers, so I began doing leg exercises, such as kicks and squats. Then I did deep meditation exercises. Other people before me had scratched words onto the old walls, so I squinted my eyes up close to the walls to examine them. Then I spun around in circles, singing songs, she wrote. Wei sang out loud, both to cheer herself up and to let the other detained women hear her voice and know that they were not alone, that she too was in there with them. Li Maizi also sang back a song for all women, the anthem of China's feminist movement. Protect my rights, don't keep me down, why must I lose my freedom? Let's break free from our heavy shackles and reclaim our power as women. Her spirits buoyed, Wei Tingting writes, she recovered her sense of defiance. Even as I heard 2 guards walking back and forth, making clanking noises outside, I felt a kind of joy in betraying Big Brother.
First of all, Leta, congratulations on your book. It's such an important book. It's so powerful. You write it beautifully, and it so resonates with so much of what's happening around the world. I remember when I was on book tour in 2015, and I was connecting what was happening in the Middle East and North Africa, especially for women, feminists, and activists, with what's happening around the world. And I remember mentioning the Feminist Five as part of what I would call this kind of feminist global moment, where you have women in different countries fighting patriarchy in their various contexts. And what I love about your book, and what I'd love to share with the audience tonight, is how incredible it is that a feminist movement in China, where the Communist Party has been in power for 70 years, led these 5 young women to be imprisoned for feminism. Because this idea that feminism terrifies authoritarians is something that delights me, but also fascinates me. So I'd love for us to start with kind of a quick overview of women, feminism, and especially because I went to China in 1995 for the UN Women's Conference. I didn't know very much about Chinese feminism. So if you could kind of give us the history of Chinese feminism that led to the conference, and then from that to the arrests in 2015, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, well, it's going to have to be really, really brief. But with the communist revolution in 1949, shortly after that, in the early communist era, Mao Zedong decided that it was really important to bring women into the workforce to help build this new communist China. And so one of his most famous sayings, which most people have heard of, is "women hold up half the sky." And so women were brought out of the household into the workforce in unprecedented ways, or made to work in the fields. And the propaganda at the time was very much that women are equal to men. Women can do whatever men can do. There would be a lot of posters showing, you know, a female welder with really robust muscles and red cheeks, or driving a bulldozer. And all of these images and policies were to emphasize that there was a basic foundational principle of communist China was gender equality. And gender equality was also a huge rallying cry to mobilize women, to get them into the communist revolution to begin with. So that was a huge part of the early communist era. And then with the onset of market reforms at the end of the 1970s into the 80s and 90s, in particular, there was a huge resurgence of gender inequality in many ways. And I write about this in my first book, Leftover Women. And so there were so many different factors involved, including an unprecedented new form of gender wealth gap. The gender income gap really skyrocketed. The previously extremely high female labor force participation at the end of the 1970s, there were around 90% of women in Chinese cities were employed. That began to fall really precipitously. And so with the dismantling of the planned economy and the onset of market reforms, women were the first to be laid off, and women were the last to be rehired. And so women really suffered the brunt of these wrenching changes that were brought on by breakneck economic development. And so even though women as well as men benefited from economic reforms, the gap, the gender gap, really exponentially increased. And so it was at that time, it's in response to this new resurgence of gender inequality and new forms of really drastic gender discrimination that there is a new generation of young women who've decided to embrace feminism, and they're independent of the Communist Party. And that's one of the things that's so extraordinary about this movement, is that in the past, the Communist Party was always saying, well, we liberate women, and it's very much top down. And the rhetoric is, these women are always being told, we've already liberated you, end of story, you don't need to do anything else. But these young women today, over the last few years, have been demanding much more freedom, equality, justice, dignity, and it's a really astonishing development.
Right. Thank you for that. And, you know, I'm from Egypt, and I write a lot about the Middle East, and I'm also a US citizen, so it's really important for me that we connect all of these things happening, you know, across the sisterhood, across feminist networks around the world. And, you know, we're speaking now, and there are at least 8 Saudi feminists many more also prevented from traveling, but at least 8 to 12 Saudi feminists who were imprisoned in Saudi Arabia, and they've been imprisoned since the middle of May. And it's an unprecedented crackdown against feminists and women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia. And in a way, it reminds me of what happened to the Feminist Five, because when the Feminist Five were arrested in 2015 in the run-up to International Women's Day, it was an unprecedented crackdown on feminism and women's rights activists. And I'd love to explore with you this fact that authoritarians, the patriarchy around the world, whether the patriarchy is an absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia, or it is the leader of the Communist Party in China, or the military regime in my country of birth, or Donald Trump here in the United States, they are all connected by this beating heart of patriarchy and misogyny. So could you tell us especially about why those 5 activists were arrested in 2015, and what is it especially now about feminist activists in China that is making this incredibly powerful party arrest feminists?
Yeah, it's really incredible. What happened in 2015 was so shocking to everybody. In 2015, there were a group of feminist activists in a lot of different Chinese cities were planning to celebrate International Women's Day by handing out stickers about sexual harassment on subways and buses. And so they were coordinating with each other across different cities. And before they even did anything, the Chinese authorities in all these different cities rounded them up. It was a very sweeping round of arrests, carried out at exactly the same time. And they arrested a lot of women, but then released some of them and ended up focusing on 5 young women in Beijing, Guangzhou, and Hangzhou, and brought all of the women to the same detention center in Beijing. And it looked like the women were on course to being prosecuted and serving a jail term of up to 5 years and there were some various technical terms thrown, but basically it was disturbing the social order. So in deciding to crack down on these young women, the government had apparently by then decided that, perhaps these young women are starting to get really organized, and we'd better just nip it in the bud. Let's make sure that there isn't going to be a large-scale feminist movement on our hands, because that would be a real hassle. But what the authorities did drastically backfired, because in trying to nip this movement in the bud, it actually galvanized so many young people. It galvanized the feminist community inside China, which was already kind of sizable. There were, several hundred rather committed activists. But then there were so many other young women who had never taken feminism seriously before. And then they realized, my God, these young women are just like me. They've gone to college, they're part of the urban middle class. They're really young, they're intelligent, they're funny. I mean, how could they possibly be sentenced to a jail term? And it wasn't just feminists, there were even, there were male workers who had been helped by one of the feminist activists in particular, because she was involved in labor rights activism as well. So there were some male workers who took photographs of themselves, and notably one worker took off his shirt and wrote in big red letters on his back, 郑楚然大兔, giant rabbit is her nickname, the proletariat supports you, and posted that picture on China's equivalent of Twitter, Weibo. And so that was inside China. There was this big, it galvanized and angered a lot of people inside China, but outside China, there were so many protests in a lot of different cities around the world. There was a huge amount of diplomatic pressure. Hillary Clinton at the time was considered to be the front runner for president, and she tweeted her outrage at the arrest of these feminist activists. And so it was all of the combination of the uproar inside and outside China just put so much pressure on the government, and after 37 days, these women were released. And I really consider that the movement as such that has gained momentum really began becoming a political movement after the release of the women.
The great feminist scholar Bell Hooks said soon after Donald Trump was elected. Now, usually when I have events of my own, I call him a fascist fuck, but I will keep my profanity at a limit because this is your event, not my event to say fuck. However, Audre Lorde said soon after Donald Trump was elected that feminism needs to become a political movement again. We can't just leave it as this lifestyle, as this, fashion or whatever. And I'm so glad that you said that, because I think one of the things that terrifies authoritarians the most about feminist movements that are political is what you said earlier about the male workers who wrote, or that particular male worker who wrote, "The proletariat stands with you." Because I know in Egypt, the military regime in the run-up to the elections, their phobia, what they couldn't stand was the idea that activists who were using the online space would form solidarity with workers in the factories, would form solidarity with the lawyers, with the doctors. And I know through one of the Feminist Five that I was honored to meet with through you, Datu Jiang Shuran, I know that she has worked with laborers, she has worked with the women who work in factories who make our phones and others. And I know that she and another of the activists that I met through you also do a lot of LGBTQ work. And I would like to talk especially about this last point, the kind of like the cross current between the feminist movement and the queer movement generally in China. Could you give us an idea of why they started to work together and why the feminists decided to kind of to do the work that they do now?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because actually among the most committed core feminist activists, quite a few of them are queer. And several of them said to me that it's because if you're a straight woman, you're already kind of straight-jacketed. You're fitting inside that normative relationship. And if you take the step of coming out as queer, as loving women, or having some kind of non-normative sexuality, you're already breaking the boundaries in a way. And then it's easier to make that additional ideological leap to believe in feminism and the liberation or emancipation of women and non-binary people as well. And quite a few of these feminist activists who were queer started out in the LGBTQ rights movement, and then they got so angry at the chauvinism of the gay men in that movement. And that's how some of the activists became really fervent feminists, because they thought that you cannot have a proper LGBTQ rights movement without feminism. And so for a lot of them, coming out as queer came, in fact, practically all of them came out as queer before they embraced feminism. But there's a lot of overlap between, and I write about this as well, between the feminist movement, not just with the LGBTQ rights movement, but in particular with the labor rights movement. And this is something that, a lot of people have written about the labor rights movement and growing labor unrest, but women are increasingly on the front lines of that kind of labor unrest. And so many of the workers who are being exploited in China are women. But it's only been very recently that those factory women are starting to gain a kind of feminist consciousness themselves. With we'll probably talk about Me Too later, but with the onset of Me Too, there are also some factory women who wrote essays about how they had been sexually harassed and they were really tired of it. Why did they have to put up with this from their male coworkers or from their supervisor? But I have to say that's really incipient. The feminist movement has really started at its core around university campuses, around students, people who've gone to university or have graduated from university.
And we will get to Me Too, but just before we do, I want to remind the audience that the importance of China and the importance of Leta's book and the importance of the feminist movement is this startling figure. 1 of every 5 women across the world is Chinese. 1 out of every 5 women around the world is Chinese. So anything that happens in China, this incredibly important and courageous feminist movement, and anything that the Chinese government does that affects women is going to have tremendous impact around the world. So I'd like you to share with the audience later, and I know that you touch on this in your book, but what the Chinese government, especially the Chinese leader, has been doing recently, and the policies that have changed, and I know this, we could talk about this for hours, but just kind of briefly, the reproductive rights policies that have changed in China and how it depends on what ethnic group you come from and which kind of what the focus is of the government, because I think it really kind of highlights what reproductive rights and reproductive control means and what it can mean depending on what minority or majority group you come from.
Right. Well, that's really important because, of course, one of the main reasons why these feminists are seen as a threat by the Communist Party is simply because they're so well organized. They've been able to mobilize so many people across China. And that in itself, anybody who's able to do that is inherently viewed as a huge threat. But it's not just their ability to mobilize and organize. It is also that the message of these feminists strikes at the very core of authoritarianism in China. And I have this whole chapter, China's patriarchal authoritarianism. So a lot of people who are analyzing why it is that the Communist Party has been able to survive, why communist rule has lasted for so long in China, in spite of the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and across Eastern Europe. There are so many different theories that scholars have come up with about different kinds of authoritarian control. But I feel that it's absolutely central is the subjugation of women. And that has really intensified under Xi Jinping, the current president, who very recently abolished presidential term limits. So he could theoretically be president for life. So there's a huge sharp turn towards even more authoritarianism under him. But even before him, the Communist Party had long or always viewed women as reproductive tools of the state. And so in the past, under the so-called one-child policy, it's been very widely documented, all of these abuses of women's rights, forced abortions or forced mass implantation of IUDs. And all of that happened for over 35 years. There's a massive apparatus, population planning, that has invaded into the most intimate details of every woman's life to monitor and surveil them and find out, when are you pregnant? Did you have a period? Oh, you didn't have a period. Does that mean you're pregnant? When are you going to have a baby? All of this level of invasiveness is really extraordinary and frightening. So at the end of 2015, the Chinese government finally began to be quite alarmed or took action on the fact that birth rates were starting to fall precipitously. So the government's really alarmed by falling birth rates and the aging of the population and the shrinking of the workforce. And so now it's reversing the population planning controls. And rather than saying everybody has to control, get rid of extra children, now it is trying to coerce, persuade at first, but in some cases beginning to coerce, certainly through propaganda, mainly educated Han Chinese women, to try to push them into getting married and having children, having more than one baby. And so now officially there's a 2-child policy, but even with the 2-child policy, the birth rates have still fallen. And so there's talk of the government maybe removing birth restrictions altogether. But no matter what they end up doing, it's always going to be very tight control over women's bodies. And so you can see right now that there's a strong element of eugenics in the population planning. So while the government wants these so-called high-quality, educated Han Chinese women to have more babies, and by the way, women are resisting that, and that's why the message of feminism is such a threat, because the feminists are telling ordinary Chinese women, you don't have to do that. You don't have to get married. Why should you have to have a baby or two when you don't want to? You should be free to do what you want. So the message of feminism, the fact that it's so popular, combined with the highly effective organizational strategies, all of that makes the feminist movement a huge, unprecedented challenge. Back to the eugenics element. It's been so widely reported recently. Actually, Chris Buckley here, the New York Times just did a really good story from Xinjiang about the mass internment of Uyghur Muslims. With regard to population planning policy, while the government, when it's thinking about Han Chinese women, says, oh, we have a huge crisis, the birth rates are falling, in Xinjiang they're saying the complete opposite. The officials in Xinjiang are saying, oh, we have worryingly high birth rates that are a severe threat to social stability. And so there are, now it's horrifying situation over there. But for many years, they have been introducing incentives, trying to offer cash bonuses to Uyghur couples to have fewer children. They're really actively trying to dilute the Uyghur Muslim population. So all of this is about controlling women, in particular, because women are the ones who have babies.
Our bodies are always the proxy battlefields across the world. One of the things that struck me the most in reading your book was how often the activists, the feminist activists that you spoke to, would say, we're not interested in toppling the regime. This isn't our goal. Our goal is destroying patriarchy, which for me is the definition of feminism. So they're not so interested in getting rid of the current leader or the future leader. Their long-term goal is patriarchy. They're aiming at patriarchy, and that's something that I hope white feminists, especially in the United States, recognize. It's not just Kavanaugh, it's not just Trump, it's patriarchy, and those are just, examples of it. And I would like you to talk about how most of the names that people know from China are male heroes, and how you've got these feminist, revolutionaries, basically, because I believe this is a feminist revolution. I think there's a global feminist revolution. How these feminist revolutionaries are not as known as the male revolutionaries, especially the dissidents, especially the Nobel Prize laureates, etc. But they're the ones who are behind the massive popularity of Me Too. They're the ones whose fight and revolution is the most appealing right now to young people in China, women, men, non-binary people, everything. And I would like it, because I think we're going to open up for questions soon. I'm very interested in your response to this, especially now in the United States, where I feel that American feminists, especially white feminists, but American feminists generally, are so insular and are so concerned with just what happens in the United States that they're oblivious to these feminist revolutions happening around the world, from which they can learn so much. So please enlighten us.
Well, I'm an American citizen, and we moved back here from Beijing and Hong Kong just a year and a half ago. And of course, I've been really alarmed by what is happening to our country and the erosion of all of our democratic institutions and the assault on women's rights, all of that. But as bad as things feel here in America, and they are very bad, it's so important to look at a country like China, where 1 out of 5 women live. It is the second largest economy in the world. It is on the ascendancy as the US, has retreated from its moral leadership role in the globe, China is sweeping in to fill that moral vacuum or that leadership vacuum in many ways. And getting back to the idea of male heroes and dissidents, I think that so often women are really overlooked in resistance movements. And I've been thinking about all of the social movements in China ever since 1989, when there was this massive pro-democracy uprising, which culminated in the Tiananmen massacre. Ever since then, there have been a lot of different kinds of social movements, but they have all disappeared. They've been effectively crushed because the government was able to target the individuals, invariably men, either jailing them, and most notably, I mean, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo, who died in custody, or exiling them. And then, and most Chinese people, very sadly, don't know anything about these dissidents in any way, because it has been very much about the heroes. But with the feminist movement, and this is something that is so powerful about it, it is not dominated by one individual. This has become very diffuse. There are a lot of women who get involved. The vast majority of them are completely anonymous. They don't want to become heroes. What they want is to transform society. They want to attack patriarchy. They know that if the Communist Party collapses, then there will just be another set of patriarchal leaders. So what they need to do is fundamentally transform society. And they take on these issues that are intensely personal to women and girls: sexual harassment, gender discrimination, whether in school or in the workplace. Domestic violence. There's such an epidemic of domestic violence in China, and the predators, you know, they all escape with impunity because China effectively has no rule of law. And so the extent of the authoritarian control of people in China, the retaliation, the punishment, just being, you know, potentially going to jail for doing something really that everybody in the US would take for granted. It's very hard for people who don't understand China to really appreciate just how all-pervasive those controls are and how severe the punishment can be. But in the face of that incredible hostile environment, hostile to the free flow of information, in this incredibly repressive environment, you have this just uprising, just a swelling of young people, and it's primarily young women, starting with young women, but actually it's quite striking how many young men are joining in this Me Too or calling for women's rights in general, because it's so vibrant. And these young people want to transform society. And it may be that they don't know enough about the Tiananmen massacre, so they're not afraid anymore, but so many more young people in China are really courageously taking on this supposedly all-powerful authoritarian system, and it's just incredibly inspiring to see.
Thank you, Leta. I'm always inspired hearing you say that. I'm going to open the floor now to questions. I urge you not to stand up and give us your thesis on revolution. Please just get to questions as briefly as possible so we can get as many questions as possible. Yes.
I'll bring you a microphone real quick.
Thanks very much. To what extent does the Chinese diaspora have a role to play in the feminist movement?
That's a really good question, and a very large role. As women have become more educated than ever before in Chinese history, a lot of these young women are going abroad to study or work. And so the core of the feminist movement is really university graduates, students as well. And quite a few of these activists who were persecuted are actually right now studying abroad. And so that the global connectivity through social media plays a really important role in sustaining the feminist movement, growing the momentum. So even though the Chinese government very heavily censors and surveils and interferes with the internet, that it's still really quite striking how many people are able to get around those kinds of barriers. But another thing to say about the role of the diaspora is that in attacking feminist activists, because there's this very severe crackdown on feminist activism in China, a line of questioning or a line of attack that is very common is for Me Too or feminist activists to be blamed, to be accused of being a tool of so-called hostile Western forces. And so this is a new thing recently that the government says, quote unquote, Western feminism is trying to infiltrate into China's management of its own women's affairs, and that everybody needs to be on guard against feminism itself, that this is something that is not natural for China, and it's a force. Anybody who allows themselves to be used as a tool of this force could be subject to charges of subversion. Some activists have, in fact, quite a few of them have said that this was what they were told. I mean, certainly the Feminist Five were all accused of being hostile Western forces and spies. But it's totally a homegrown movement. I mean, if there is porousness of ideas. China is not completely totalitarian. There is an exchange of ideas. And so with the global momentum of Me Too, there are a lot of women who have seized on that in China and used that. But it's really the work of these most committed feminist activists over the last few years that has made very fertile ground for the explosion of Me Too in China today.
Yes.
Congratulations on your book. You've mentioned the Me Too movement in China a couple of times, and I was just wondering how it's playing out there. In the US, it's gotten a huge amount of attention. There have been some really high-profile cases. Bill Cosby sentenced yesterday, Kavanaugh hearing tomorrow. Are there high-profile cases like that in China, and what kind of attention has it gotten, and how is it playing out there?
Well, it's not the same kind of high profile because the Chinese government is so opaque. And so one of the worst fears I can speculate, or I would imagine, one of the worst fears of these Communist Party leaders is that one of them would be targeted, and that's very that just spooks these Communist Party leaders. And of course, the Communist Party is entirely male-dominated, and so. But there have been a lot of cases of Me Too coming out in China. I mean, one of the highest profile cases is probably this Buddhist abbot who had to resign recently because there were some nuns who said that he had been sexually harassing them as part of the religious cultish atmosphere where these women were supposed to regard him as their master. But there have been a lot of cases. It really started to take off at the beginning of this year with actually a woman who went to school or went to university in Beijing, but then ended up working in the US. But she came out with a long, detailed personal essay about her professor at this university in Beijing who had abused her and tried to sexually assault her. And it was an incredibly detailed essay that went viral. And then there were also simultaneously a number of other women who came out and posted details about their sexual abuse or harassment. And then shortly thereafter, there was just a proliferation of all these Me Too petitions, where university students and alumni would sign all these petitions demanding that their university take sexual harassment or assault seriously on campus and punish professors who had been hitting on their students. And that was really widespread. It sprang up at dozens of universities, and you had thousands of students and alumni using their real names to sign these petitions. But it hasn't been confined to university campuses either. It's also spread to the NGO sector, where some rather prominent NGO rights activists who were men were named and had to apologize. It's also gone into the high-tech sector, and this relates to the global diaspora as well. The CEO of JD.com was accused by a Chinese student, actually in Minnesota, of sexual assault, and he's gone back to China. But the thing is that that a lot of women who were previously thought that they had to stay silent about something that was incredibly humiliating or shameful, they thought it's a similar dynamic to all the outpouring of women globally. Seeing solidarity and strength in numbers, that women are seeing the strength in numbers for the first time in China, and they're willing to take these extraordinary risks because the retaliation, as difficult as it is for women in a country like America to come out, it is exponentially more difficult for a young woman in China to do that. And the price she pays for coming out like that, and it's not just women either, but it is primarily women. So it takes extraordinary courage, and yet we're seeing a real critical mass of young women deciding to take the leap because they're burning to tell their story, even if there are no consequences for the perpetrator. And that is what makes this movement, this women's rights movement, so powerful, because it's very hard to control. I mean, in the past, the government could just arrest these prominent male dissidents, and then nobody would know about them. Nobody would know about them in China. But with this movement, it is everywhere. It's exploding everywhere, all across China. And you can't, the floodgates have opened. And it's all the more astonishing that it's happening in this incredibly repressed, closed society where, you post something on the internet and it could be deleted within minutes. And that doesn't stop these women. And, or they could be, there was the case of this Peking University student named Yue Xin, who was a Me Too activist. And in the middle of the night, 1 a.m., her Communist Party advisor broke into her dorm room with her mother and demanded that she delete all her files related to Me Too on her computer and her phone. And then her advisor then threatened her and said, "You'd better stop this or you're going to be charged with subversion," and placed her under house arrest. This is China's most prestigious university. And that didn't stop her. Now she's gone down, she graduated, and she's joined the labor rights movement in southern China, and she's working to unionize workers at a factory there. And so it really is, I see it as very, very hard to control, and that is what is so unprecedented and transformative about this movement.
Yes? I have a question that pertains to your last comment about the practicalities of resistance in China. Can you elaborate more on how this woman is achieving this for workers' rights and in southern China? Like, what does that look like? But besides, I mean, and they're deleting WeChat posts, and they're kind of.
Well, I mean, the deletion of your posts on WeChat, which is a group messaging platform, or Weibo, that's just par for the course. Everybody deals with that. That's very typical. So you don't have Google, you don't have YouTube, you don't have Facebook. You have the Chinese equivalent, which is very heavily censored and controlled. That's just what ordinary citizens have to put up with. But for activists, I mean, they just, well, what happened to this particular woman, Yue Xin, who was a Me Too activist when she was a student at Peking University? Now she's expanded beyond that feminism to become a real a labor rights activist. She and a whole bunch of other activists who, quite strikingly, all went to, a lot of them went to prestigious universities. Some of them took on factory jobs. And one of the women is still she's just disappeared, but she's certainly been detained. We just don't know what happened to her. Yue Xin herself ended up being released along with a number of other activists. But I mean, there was just a raid on this group of largely a lot of students from prestigious universities who were then trying to unionize workers at this factory. And the police came around dawn and raided them and arrested them and held them incommunicado for a while, and then released some of them, but not all of them. So basically, you're just subject to completely arbitrary detention or disappearance. So I mean, there are so many people who have just literally disappeared, and we don't know what happens to them. Or maybe some of them will later appear on TV giving a coerced so-called confession, and then they're released, confessing that they did something wrong.
How do you see it playing? How do you see it playing out? You have a Chinese government increasingly interested in keeping track of this feminist movement, or shutting it down, or controlling it, and on the other hand, you have women who seem to be increasingly interested in expanding it. And when you look down the road 5 or 10 years, how do you see it playing out? It seems like something's coming.
It's already here. It's a massive confrontation happening right now, and it's of seismic importance, where you have this incredible, really unprecedented rising up of young women, particularly educated urban women, with the rapidly expanding middle class. But that's expanding even beyond the middle class into the working class now. So we're talking about millions, tens of millions of women. They're rising up. I use that in terms of their consciousness, that they've become aware of their rights, that they're much more aware. Very recently, a critical mass of women, young women, have become aware that they can stand up and make demands, that they don't have to suffer in silence, and there's strength and safety in numbers. That's going to increase. That momentum is growing. And on the other side, you have the world's most powerful authoritarian regime with the most brutal tools at its disposal. Just think back to Tiananmen Massacre. I don't think that's going to happen again. But look at what's happening in Xinjiang, where they've interned 1 million Uyghur Muslims. I mean, and the government is determined, the Communist Party is determined to stay in power no matter what it takes. And I don't know. I don't think anybody can predict what is going to happen. But I have to say, I am really filled with hope and inspiration when I see the incredible idealism and courage of these young people, young women, but also young men, who, you know, getting back to America, so many people are just despairing at our disaster of a president and the Republican Party, and of course the assault on women's rights. But, you know, at least we have elections here. We have a semi-functioning democracy. We have the freedom to go out on the streets and protest. We have a free press. There is no free press in China. So what is it that caused Me Too to go viral? Of course, Me Too, you know, was founded by an African-American civil rights activist, Tarana Burke, years ago. But why did it go viral? It was because of this in-depth news reporting from the New York Times and the New Yorker, pointing out, you know, the sexual predations of this famous Hollywood producer, and all these household names, famous Hollywood actresses came out and said, I was sexually harassed. And that got people's attention, so it made it go viral, because these famous, you know, white Hollywood actresses were all being sexually abused. But what's incredible is that the momentum in China, that the bravery of all of these young women, the anger is coming out. And I don't see how that is really stoppable. And that's why I think this poses an unprecedentedly complicated challenge or threat, if you want to call it that. It's definitely perceived as a grave threat by the Communist Party. And, you know, we don't know what's going to happen.
Okay, last question, back there.
We're seeing when sexual assault survivors come out in the United States, the common responses for dismissing those are, you know, attacking the survivor's credibility. What were they wearing? Were they drinking? Are there similar trains of thought in China in response to these survivors coming out?
Oh, absolutely. So every single thing that is so horrifying about coming out as a woman, as a survivor of sexual assault in America, every single humiliating smear or, you know, vicious retaliation tactic, everything that you have to put up with as an American woman or European woman coming out as a sexual assault survivor, Chinese women have to deal with that. On top of that, they're living in this society where there is no freedom of the press. No reporter is going to report on them. So their story's not going to get out. They can try to post it on the internet, and they do, but then it's deleted. It's often deleted. Not everything is deleted, but it can be deleted sometimes within seconds. If they try to sue, well, there's no chance that they're going to win, because there's no sexual harassment law and there's no functioning legal system or independent judiciary. The retaliation there can involve going to jail. And the Feminist Five were jailed because, well, the issue that they took on was sexual harassment. And they wanted to hand out stickers. They didn't even do it. They were just planning on handing out sexual harassment stickers to raise awareness. The only thing that the authorities in China do to respond in some ways, recently the Women's Federation in Beijing actually did put up signs saying, oh, beware of sexual harassment on the subway. But because that came from the government, that was, of course, okay. But meanwhile, the feminist activists who were calling for that years ago are still being persecuted. But absolutely, smearing, you know, coming up with the worst lies and vicious fake conspiracy theories and very ugly rumors, just you know, forcing women out of their homes. Often a very common tactic is to persuade the landlord of a young woman who's been involved in a feminist activity. The police will go to her landlord and say, she's a troublemaker, kick her out. So a lot of these women are, first of all, they're constantly being hauled in for interrogation. But then they're often having to move out of their apartments too, because their landlords kick them out under police pressure. And not only that, but there's also the pressure on the family members. Like USC at Peking University, for example, in the middle of the night, the Communist Party advisor brought that woman's mother in. So first they terrorized her mother and then dragged her mother in to make her feel guilty and say, look what you're doing, you're a bad daughter. Look what you're causing, to happen to your mother. And that is a very common strategy of controlling the population, is that, okay, the authorities know these young women are very brave, they're not afraid, and many of them are not afraid to go to jail, but they do worry about their parents. And that is where it just becomes so terrifying, where the parents or other relatives are retaliated against, or sometimes even, arrested or held or charged simply for being related to the activist.
Okay, Leta, thank you so much. I urge everyone to read this book carefully and be inspired by how feminism and the power of feminists can terrify authoritarians, and then implement whatever you learn from this book here in the United States, because God knows we need it, because the patriarchy is everywhere and we must destroy it everywhere. And Leta, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mona. Thanks, everybody.